In this video, I'm going to show you how to repair the tip or trailing edge of a rudder. It happens to be from some of the cats, but as you can see, in every year you tend to get some kind of damage on the bottom of the rudders due to them hitting the beach or getting dragged behind the boat when you're trailering it. First thing to do is to kind of sand it, try and smooth it out a bit before you start working on it. In this particular case, there's quite the crack down the center of this one, so we'll try and clean that out a little bit, and I'll use some filler to fill that. Wet and dry sandpaper in the 220 grit range will work fine for sanding any gel coat or epoxy filler. We're going to use the West System epoxy system for repairing the rudders, as it's much stronger than the polyester resins. You take one pump of the resin with one pump of the hardener into a container, stir it with a popsicle stick, use gloves until it's stirred evenly. Then you can start to add some of these microfiber adhesive filler. Just start adding it slowly until you get the consistency of it that you want it to, like a putty. You want it to be, depending on your application, you might want it thin, you might want it thick. In this case, we'll get it, medium thickness for making sure it gets into all the cracks and bonds to where we want it to. Okay, mixing the epoxy resin. Just do one full pump all the way, one stroke on each one, and with the hardener, and that will give you the right mixture. And then basically with the stir stick, you got your gloves on, you got to do some vigorous mixing. Now that I've mixed the epoxy in, you can see it's all a single kind of goldy color. Then we want to take some of the microfibers and start putting them in. Give them a good mix around. Probably should actually wear a mask as well while you're doing this, just so that it's quite dusty, gets in the air and you breathe it in a little. But you start just to mix it up and then get the consistency you want. That's pretty thin. You're going to want something thicker. So I actually used that thinner mixture and drizzled it into the cracks, because obviously if you get something a little too thick, it isn't going to want to make it down into the thin cracks. For the rest of the, let me get that to focus. For the rest of the components, and just to fair that off, I'll want to use a thicker mixture, because otherwise it's going to run down the side of the board. So I didn't put too much more of the microfibers in. And you'll see that it's now a fairly thick mixture. It stays on the stick, and that's kind of what you want when you're doing filling, so that things don't run down. But you got to be careful. Just put a little bit in at a time, and it'll get thicker and thicker. And then, as I say, that was only maybe 3/4 of one of these scoops. Well, 3/4 of one of these that went into that. So it doesn't take much. If you make it too thick, then you kind of got to start over. Now it's kind of like you got to be very careful and a little more of an artist, and just try and put this stuff on as smoothly as you can, because otherwise you got a lot of sanding to do to get it back off later, and it's fairly hard. So here, I'll show you putting some on. Just putting on to cover this piece right here. So just get a little bit on your stick and put it over the area. But then you want to, it doesn't matter if you leave a little bit up, but you don't want to be all over the place with it, because then you just got a lot of work to kind of smooth it off afterwards. But that's the general idea. Okay, here's numerous examples of putting on the epoxy with the filler. You just kind of put it on as nicely as you can. It's kind of like putty. You build it up a little bit so that you can sand it back off to where you'd like it to be. Like on this one, there's kind of extra around the edges, but that will sand off fairly easily because it's not a big thick chunk of it, right? So, and then once we sand that off, where'd you go? There you go. Okay, once we sand that off, we'll be able to gel coat it, and that'll make it look nice and new. Here's some more examples. Put some more on the bottom of that. We'll just gel coat that dark patch. It's just where the gel coat's worn off. There's no sort of filler holes that need to be done. And this one needed a little touch up on the back. And this guy, same thing. There was a nick out of the bottom here that you could fill and then be able to sand that off. What you will see, and you're seeing it there, the stuff will sag a little bit. So you may have to go around before it hardens and just touch it back up. Not touch it up, but pull it back up kind of thing. Depending on the thickness of your liquid. Okay, so I've let the epoxy cure for over 24 hours. And now you just take the same 220 sand grit wet and dry paper and start sanding it off. This, you'll recall, is the one that had the big crack in the bottom. And you can see with putting a little bit of the thinner stuff in and then a little thicker over it, and then just sand it into a nice shape. So we've done that with all the different foils. Next step will be to put a bit of gel coat on that and then lightly sand it again. Here's another example. This one actually had a split in the forward end of the rudder, and again drizzled some epoxy in there and then put the thicker putty solution on it and then sanded it off, and it's now ready for gel coating as well.